Everybody, I know it's the top of the hour. It's 3 o'clock here, but I think we're going to have maybe a couple more minutes for folks to get on. But we've got today's icebreaker up there for, I think, don't we? Yeah. Am I blocking it? Nope. Would help.
Next slide.
First slide. There we go. Yeah. So now we're getting all set. We're all discombobulated. I've been tearing my office down. We've been internet issues. We're just doing it all today. So so it looks like today's question is a 500-mile journey, plane or car. So it's funny you have this question up for today, Patricia, because I have to drive to Florida and back in 2 days this weekend. So I get 2,000 miles in 2 days. So.
Wow.
Yep. So yeah, if you're just joining us, we're getting ready to get started, but feel free to use the chat function and put up today's question. Answers to today's question, which is a 500-mile journey, plane or car.
See, I love a good plane ride, but we are so limited in Houghton. You know, we have 2 flights a day to Chicago, and those 2 flights have to hit connecting flights, and it makes it really difficult to get anywhere by airplane. So you usually get there faster in the car.
So you're in a part of the country, it's really nice driving around, right?
Yeah, it is really nice. My favorite is heading downstate. So it takes about 5 hours to get to the Mackinac Bridge from where I live. And then it's just impressive every single time. It never loses its awe, you know, crossing that Mackinac Bridge.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to let folks continue to put that chat in there. Just also another friendly reminder, if you've got things that need to be covered up Wednesday and Thursday night, you better cover them up. Near record cold here in Central Ohio, down at around 20 degrees. And so it is time. So just a friendly weatherman reminder as we get started. Wednesday night and Thursday night, low 20s. So hopefully not, most of the things should be okay. I mean, they're pretty hardy, but we've had fairly warm March. So anyway. I'll take my cue from you, Patricia. If you want me to go ahead and go, I'll go ahead and go.
Sounds good. Let's get this thing rolling.
Yeah, let's get started. So yeah, welcome back. This is session 5 of this adaptation planning and practices. Certainly excited to hear our discussion and conversation today as we continue working through our workbooks here. Can you go ahead and close for me? Nope. Okay. All right. So just remember, kind of keep muted and unmute your line when you're going to talk, and try to avoid any of that background distraction. But certainly today we're going to be talking about monitoring and evaluating effectiveness of adaptation actions, and we're going to have plenty of opportunities for discussion. I know based on our individual meetings with groups that I had, one of the things that you're already really valuing from this whole process is interacting with others. Going through this process together. So we want to allow plenty of time for that today in our discussion. So today's session is going to be led by myself to begin with, kind of reviewing step 4 and some discussion. And then Kristen's going to take it away for step 5 on the monitoring aspects, and she's going to conclude our presentation for today. Patricia will be here. She's going to be running the controls. We've got a couple of poll questions for you today. So she's also with us. Okay, so our agenda today for session 5 is, again, adaptation actions on step 4, then step 5, monitoring. Talk a little bit about the workbook, again, the tutorial and the homework and assignment for next week. Picture of the daffodils or jonquils, or I know there's all kinds of different. My uncle's in Alabama. He says nobody calls them daffodils here. They're all called jonquils, right? So certain species. But anyway, kind of to review step 4 and think about the work this week, thinking about these climate-driven changes, and essentially what we're doing in terms of this process. In any management, project typically you all have a very good understanding of the system that you're trying to manage, right? This is why you're here. You understand your system. It's based on the collective knowledge of that system, of that area, and your own observations of how the system works, right? And how the system can respond to disturbances, how it's responded in the past, and what types of disturbances are likely to drive changes on your, in your particular land or your project. So we really want to utilize and use that knowledge to implement this management plan, right? That's really what this whole process encourages, and to help maintain or move that system into a desired future condition. So we have our system and our management now. We want to move that continuously into a desired future outcome. Of course, then along comes climate change, right? So this climate change trajectory complicates that path that we maybe would have taken to that desired condition, because it changes not just kind of the average climate conditions, but it's also affecting other things that threaten or stress and influence your systems and those ecosystems, right? So we're trying to maintain suitable conditions despite the climate change. We often talk about climate change as a threat multiplier, right? It makes what we do harder to do it, whatever we're in, transportation, health, farming. And it might mean intensifying your local, your typical management, or investing in some strategies that can either minimize that disturbance, lessen the impact, or help transition that system. And I like this phrase, to bounce back after a disturbance. And I've often also heard of it, if you've ever, Laura, I'm trying to remember her last name, Laura Langstrip. She talks about not always bouncing back, but also thinking about how to bounce forward, So building that resilience to that climate change trajectory could mean increasing resources to maintain those desired outcomes because of the higher risk, right? So, the hardest part of adaptation really can sometimes be figuring out how to narrow down your options. There are a lot of options. And of course, NIAX with this program and their partners have developed adaptations, these adaptation menus that can serve as a guide to help identify the actions that are really relevant for your particular location. Also your site conditions, the anticipated climate change impacts, and how those impacts affect the different projects even represented in this cohort. And there are different menus for projects that focus on forest and agriculture or recreation, urban forestry, wetland management. And I think all of you are doing some sort or a combination of those types of projects here. So for step 4, your task was really to choose which menu best suited your project. And those menus were then provided in the adaptation workbook. So this menu of possible actions that allows you to decide what is most relevant for a particular location and set of conditions. And there are a lot of benefits to these adaptation menus. I mean, one of them being you can really connect broad ideas related to adaptation and specific actions that can be integrated into your work plan, right? The hierarchy of actions in a menu also identify your intentions at multiple levels of response. This gives you the basis for the vocabulary to help communicate your ideas. So how can we effectively communicate our ideas? We do that by increasing the terms that are associated with the types of actions that we want to take. And finally, the menus give examples of specific actions that really help boost the creativity, right? You've already demonstrated, and I've heard quite a bit of the creativity that you're just thinking about and implementing your management strategies here, and to really help you then brainstorm and hone in on specific actions that are going to work for your project. And so this all allows us, these benefits allow us to address challenges and implement the adaptation along with these other, these benefits throughout the process. So this is the work that you're doing. All right, so, adaptation actions themselves don't always look different, right? They don't always look different from the good management that you're already doing, right? They don't have to look different. Sustainable management, best management practices, BMPs as we call them, or other frameworks, they're really intended to maximize ecosystem health while providing numerous benefits. And what necessarily makes them adaptation actions is that they're addressing specific climate change impacts, right? That's what makes them adaptation actions. So you may already find yourself doing current management actions, especially in the near term, that are climate adaptation actions. Most of these actions identified in a course like this fall into that category. Actions that you may already be doing and may not look that different, especially in those projects that focus on the near term, like I said. So a smaller portion of any adaptation actions that you might take are going to fall into a second category. That category really we can think of as it can be based on a business as usual, right, management, but you have some small tweaks in what you're doing that provide greater effectiveness in a changing climate, right? Changing just small little things to improve the effectiveness of that management under new climate conditions. And then finally, a third category here of adaptation actions really falls into the new and different actions to consider. And it's important to note too, if what one project or one manager thinks is wild and crazy or kind of off the wall kind of management for this project, it might just be a small tweak in another project, right? So we can't really compare, whether, one action should be new and different across all projects. It's really project dependent. And again, it's based on the accumulation of the work that you've already done in this course. So it really depends on how much change you're really willing to take or are able to accommodate, right? So is it most of it will be much like what you're doing, right? But especially in the near term, or maybe some small tweaks and also some new and different actions, but a larger portion of those really fall into what you're already doing, okay? So kind of to review again a little bit more from that step 4, we talked about, at the highest level of adaptation planning are these concepts of resistance, resilience, and transition, right? Or response, I should say resistance, resilience, and response. The difference between these is the degree of change that you're willing to tolerate, right? So under resistance, we're thinking about actions that are designed to prevent change from improving, or by improving the defenses of your forest against disturbances, or your fields against those disturbances. Looking at the climate projections, this option is probably the most effective over the short term. How to build resilience based on these climate projections so that, your system is maintained, right? The second concept being resilience, right? The resilience, which recognizes that we can't prevent change, right? We have to accommodate some degree of change here. Actions are designed to help the forest or your agricultural area recover from inevitable disturbances. And we do that by creating healthy and vigorous ecosystems, right? Healthy and vigorous systems are able to withstand or be resilient to the changes that we're expecting. And then finally, the third concept is in transition. Recognizes that change may happen too fast, right? Change is happening too fast for individual species or ecosystem components to respond. So these actions are designed to help respond to change and redirect that system to one that's aligned with the newer changing conditions, right? If we're expecting to have conditions more like our southern state, do we transition the management to one that is more resilient under these new changing conditions? So you may find also that your project falls entirely in one of these categories, right? Or several of the management units fall into different categories. You know, is it resistance or resistance and resilience or resilience and transition? It's really based on what you're starting with and what ultimately you're trying to do with your land. Okay, so that's kind of, you know, what was all about step 4 here. So what we're going to do is we're going to launch a poll. Patricia is going to launch a poll here. We'll share the results in just a moment, but we want you to answer this poll question. What categories would you say your identified actions fall into? And you can check all that apply here. So are these actions that you're planning something you're already doing, part of the current management plan? Are they tweaks, modifications to the planned actions? Are they new and different actions? Or are these actions you identified but did not recommend? You know, do you have actions that you identified but did not recommend because of the ultimate challenges here? So we'll let this go for a few minutes and try to get everybody a chance to answer.
Yep. Sorry, I'm in a meeting though. What's up? Okay.
So we've got 4 of you. There's a few more actually. Yeah. We'll let this go here for just 30 more seconds or so. How are we doing on answers? 3.
Yeah, we've got 6 4 people, 4 to 6 people, 6 out of 6.
Okay, yeah, because it might be waiting for a response from, no, it's not actually. Okay. So maybe another 10 seconds or so. We'll see if there's any more. I think that's about it. So
sounds fair.
Yeah, let's go ahead. So yeah, so tweaks, modifications to those planned actions certainly was the top result there. So we'll come back to that in just a moment. Keep that in mind. We're going to have a plenty of discussion here in just a moment. So we're going to launch another poll now. Okay, so we're again thinking about the resistance, resilience, and transition framework. You know, what adaptation concepts does your project fall under? And you can check all that apply here. So are we talking about systems that are just resilience or just resistance or just transition? Is it a mix? You know, do you have certain areas of your land that you expect will, you know, or your management project that you expect will have to transition, while some you can build resilience or resistance to? So just thinking about the blend of those individual adaptations, you know, the concepts of your project and where do they fall? And again, we'll be thinking about these a little bit more and discussing them as you know, the rest of this first section of today goes. Yeah, so I think we're there pretty much. So we're talking, you know, really a lot of resilience and transition and a mix, or a mix of all 3, but not necessarily just resistance. So let's keep that in mind with the poll question here. And we'll go on to the next slide, which is actually time to open it up. And we want to hear from you. We want to share and we want to communicate and talk about, you know, really excited to hear what specific adaptation actions you're considering for your project area. And really answer 2 questions here. You know, what adaptation actions are you considering, and do they address your major impacts or challenges? And we'll think about them too from the framework of sort of the management actions that you've been doing, some tweaks or small change, or new and wild ideas. We can also talk about the resistance, resilience, and transition. So let me open up my screen here so I can get us all in the screen. Who would like to share or answer this question first? I'm going to have to call on you like I do my students, right? You know what? I'm going to pick on you, Vicki. Are you willing to talk about?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine. Yes, fantastic.
I knew you were going to do that
You're in
somehow.
well, you're
I-
center square. There we go.
Well, and I can't tell. I'm on my phone because we actually had a tree,
Oh,
a neighbor's tree hit a power line in the wind this morning, and tree removal service are out here, and I'm on my phone hoping the battery lasts.
okay.
But I think what you're asking, I'll look at my rough notes here.
Sure.
Part of what we want to do is we have 3 zones. We have like a crop zone, which is a managed grassland, and we have associated lands. One is a riparian buffer and the other is a hardwood and food forest. And then the third one is a wetland. And so one of the it seems like across the board, what we're looking at is weed management. And so some of the traditional things that we have to do is get the weeds under control, but thinking in a systems setting, how do you do it? I mean, on one hand, wouldn't it be great to go out and just burn all 75 acres? But it's like, oh, then you're taking out insects and ground nesting birds and, all kinds of things. And so that doesn't make, it makes sense on one hand, but we have to look at it in a different way. And then how are we going to replace what we've burned or what we've mowed? How are we going to introduce, there's going to have to be some chemical control, I think, but we're looking at overseeding, and adding to the seed bed that's already there to try to outcompete the invasives, maybe try some new varieties. And I don't know what those are yet. I know that in the food forest, what we'd like to do, because we have oaks in the riparian buffer along the creek, we'd like to clear out that understory and start replacing areas with native plants that would do well in that canopy, and then introduce some southern species. So we have different test zones to see what might be more resilient. We already know elderberry is going to do well there. And then I'm going to jump over to the food lot, the food forest. We can take acorns that are growing. We have red oaks that grow like weeds. And so we can take some acorns and just shove them into the area where we'd like the woodlot to reestablish. And that's a place where we can really play, I think, with some of the established natives and introduce some of the southern natives. Like, you said last week, buckeyes are moving north. Mm-hmm. Well, we used to have a bunch of buckeyes on our land, and will figs grow? I don't remember seeing figs in Northwest Ohio as a kid. So I'm assuming that's a more southern crop that we could try up there. Am I right about that, or am I totally off base here? But we're looking at that food forest as a real opportunity, starting from the ground up, basically, to put in some established species, the big canopy like the oak, and then play and see what we can come up with that will have that resilience and also give us some revenue. We always have to think about revenue generation. So what are some specialty crops that we could put in that food forest to do that for us? Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Well, yeah. I think you've got a lot of different management things that you're attacking. So I heard a lot of things there that I kind of want to hone in on really, really brief to kind of think about. Okay, I heard one, invasive species, right? Yep. So are you thinking from a framework of resistance and keeping invasives out, or transition to a different type of management that would then, kind of embraces the change that you'll have these invasives, or maybe a better one would be, you know, when you're thinking about the native species, and I think I brought this up before, you know, planting all natives may be resilience, right? Trying to maintain or build, I should say, resistance, having those natives versus bringing in species or establishing more resilient species to the change, or even transitioning, right? So that's one way of thinking about that. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, the invasives that are there, like the teasel and loosestrife and Canada thistle and canary reedgrass, I think if they can't, we don't want to allow them to flourish, because that's what it'll be then. And I don't think that's what we want. So I would like to look at, I guess I do have some resistance. I hadn't thought about it, because if we're doing traditional burning, mowing, trying to get to keep those current invasives at bay, that would be a resistance plan. But then the adaptation could be looking at some southern forbs and medicinal plants, because I do want to have some medicinal crops there and some cover crops and the grasses and things, so sedges and things. So we do need to find things that might be more resilient. But I know from even, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, when it was at its peak, it was all native plants 6 years ago. Now I know things have changed, but I think with the right management, we probably could maintain a nursery of mostly native plants. But because we're starting over with or continuing with what my parents did until about 5 years ago, we have an opportunity to try some new species as well. And so I think that's where the transition comes in, because are those oaks going to hold up on the creek? I think oaks are pretty, but we need to take care in case they don't, and what's going to replace them. So let's clean up the existing understory and clean up the invasives, and then start to restore the native plants, but also introduce some new species and see what happens.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I mean, no, I think, yeah, I mean, we're just trying to think about those actions and how they're addressing the specific impacts, as you mentioned, and then how they fall within the resistance resilience transition. What about Laura's and Juan, someone else that wants to chime in about their project? And
I'll go.
all right, Laura.
I apologize, but my step 4 Petras and mine have disappeared from the system, so I have to go back and put them in. But we're thinking of controlling the invasives, or well, trying to control them a little more. So we have bush honeysuckle, and we have some other species, and continuing that, and then planting more. We got a list of species from the Northern Forest research group up in Delaware like a year ago. So the seedlings and containerized plants that we're working on are targeted on those species. And since they worked on the climate atlas, I kind of trusted them to give us a good list. And and then for completely new things, Petra would like to try not planting seedlings in spring because of the summer drought, but that was really on the hill, not in the woods itself. So I don't think that really applies to our project, but that might be one that we try.
Okay. Do you find most of your actions that you take aren't much different than what you're currently taking?
Well, I guess the tweaks that we're thinking about, currently we get our seedlings from Forest Keeling out in Missouri, and we get them from Alpha Nursery in Michigan. So starting to evaluate if we should go with more southern genotypes. There's some nurseries like in Cincinnati, things like that. We read that, plants need to migrate 3.1 miles a year, 31 miles a decade. So like, if we want to be ready for 2050, 3 decades from now, should we be planting species that, can handle that? But then these cold nights, right? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, that's the thing about the change. It's not necessarily linear. It's not like next year is a little bit warmer than this year, right? It's I always equate it to the walking the dog. The dog meanders back and forth, and even though you're walking along the sidewalk and you're both walking in the general direction, you still have big deviations in the dog path, the path that the dog takes. We're going from 70 to 20 here in just 2 days, and so that's that dog meandering back and forth. And even after we've had the shifts in the growing zones and the updates to the arbor list and things that we can grow, a couple times every decade, they don't last, right? They if we don't really protect them. So I think that's really good stuff in terms of thinking about those impacts and thinking about it from a tweaks point of view versus some wild and new ideas. Juan, go ahead. Who was it?
Oh, just one other thing we're thinking about, some of our golf course partners in our watershed, like OSU Golf Course Superintendent, they've been maintaining their green ash. So we reached out to him to see if maybe we could get some green ash seedlings, things like that, and start trying to disperse green ash in places maybe that didn't have them before, so the emerald ash borer isn't around. So
yeah, so that could be, I might think of that as a wild, it might not seem like it, but maybe a wild and new idea. The fact that I think a lot of people are inclined to think the ash is going to have a tough time, right? Obviously coming back, but trying it and seeing if you can get that established is an interesting idea. Yeah. How about Agraria and community solutions?
So sorry about earlier. I didn't realize I wasn't muted.
That's okay.
Yeah, so I think for us, we're mainly doing transitioning actions because we're taking a pasture and we're taking a field and converting it into a pasture and then converting it into a silvopasture. So I think for us, it's all really just transition. There are a few existing trees in the pasture that we're probably going to keep, and going to intersperse them with a few more species that like wet feet, since it's a wetter area in the pasture. But yeah, I think for us it's mainly just transitioning, and our biggest challenge is just making sure that these whatever we plant out there survives, I think.
Yeah, so you're intentionally facilitating that change, right, to build response to the new conditions.
Yeah.
I would also argue, Sinwan, that that silvopasture as a technique in itself embodies resilience, because you're sort of planning ahead for maybe that is transition, but if there's gonna be increased heat waves, obviously increased shade improves your livestock health. So
yeah, so I guess we're transitioning it to be more resilient.
Yeah.
So there's a category for that.
Yeah, and without complicating it too much, are you building pasture and then silvopasture for today's conditions or future conditions, right? So just building resilience to today's changes versus transition, but just a kind of an aside there, thinking about that. So yeah, so we're, any other thoughts, any other comments about these adaptation actions that you're considering and how they address the impacts or challenges, how they fit within the frameworks that we've been talking about today?
Sorry, was that to us or? Sorry, was that a question for everyone or just?
Oh yeah, go if you have more to comment. In terms of how you specifically for anyone, you know, in terms of this framework and thinking about how the adaptations fit to the major impacts. No? Okay.
Sorry, I think we're just thinking about the.
No, that's okay. We're good. So I think maybe we've reached the end of the discussion period for this. We've got about 25 minutes left. Are we a little bit too soon here, Patricia? Are we okay on time, you think? Kristen, are you good?
Yeah, I think we can go
Okay.
with the flow.
All right. So let me go ahead and I'll stop sharing and turn things over now to Kristen, who's going to take you through this week's work in step 5.
Great, thank you, Aaron. I will go ahead and share my screen. All right, great discussion, everybody. This week we'll be talking about step 5, which is the last step in the adaptation workbook process. So we started in our first session with identifying our project sites, goals, and objectives. Then we assessed our climate change impacts and vulnerabilities. We evaluated our ability to meet objectives given those impacts and the challenges and opportunities they create. And then last week in step 4, we began thinking about those adaptation actions that would address our vulnerabilities and help us meet our management objectives. And so this week in step 5, we'll be wrapping up the process with monitoring. So thinking about how to evaluate the effectiveness of the adaptation actions that we've selected. So monitoring is essentially about asking the right question that will help you detect desired conditions over time. There are several different types of monitoring that you'll encounter in science and management. So for example, in scientific research as a monitoring tool, we may have a question and a hypothesis, and with replication, we can judge change over time. We don't often use this type of monitoring in adaptation planning, but it could be considered, especially with the connections that some of you may have to universities and extension. Another type of monitoring is impact or response monitoring, which describes change over time and consists of repeated measurements done to specific standards. So for example, we can use forest inventory and stocking surveys to measure growth, canopy cover, ground cover, or survival of planted seedlings. Phenology monitoring is a great example of response monitoring, where you might be recording dates of leaf out or bird arrival every spring. This type of monitoring can be expensive and time consuming though, so wherever it's possible, it's good to piggyback on existing inventories or surveys that might already be happening on your site. Then we have implementation monitoring, which can be useful if we're implementing an action because of climate change and we want to monitor the execution of that change. This is often a yes or no type of observation. Another type of monitoring is effectiveness monitoring. So if you define the desired effect, did it work? And how will you know that it worked? So for example, if you install berms to slow the overland flow of water, after some time, is the water actually slowed? Does the downhill system become less inundated? So these are just observations that you see on your site. So this type of monitoring is usually carefully designed based on a conceptual model of the system and supports cause and effect over meaningful time periods. This type of monitoring can work very well for adaptation, but you can select whichever type of monitoring best answers the questions that you framed your objectives on. So in step 5, what we're trying to do is monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of implemented actions. So the key questions that we'll be asking this week are, how do we know if the selected actions were effective? And then what can we learn from these actions to inform future management? So in this step in your adaptation workbook, you first define your monitoring variable, or that thing that you're going to measure that will tell you whether you have achieved your goals and objectives. When possible, select monitoring items that will also help you to understand whether the adaptation tactics recommended in the previous step were effective in working towards your management goals under climate change. So for example, if your tactic is to plant future adapted species that are suitable for your system, you may choose to monitor the survival rate of those particular seedlings. The second thing the workbook asks for is your criteria for evaluation, which is simply a value or threshold that once met would signal success. Think about the units that you're going to use to measure your metric and then what your target number would be. So based on the last example, what criteria for seedling survival would represent success for you? So in this example, we've chosen 60% survival as the criteria that we could use for evaluation. And finally, the workbook asks you to describe your implementation plans or how and when this information will be gathered. For example, you may monitor seedling survival every summer for 5 years after planting, and you could use volunteers and the rapid survey method. And remember, it can save time and money if you can take advantage of existing surveys, inventories, or data sets. And be thinking as well about other partnerships that can help relieve some of the burden of implementation and the monitoring. And let us know also if there are other monitoring networks that are useful and that folks should be aware of, or if you have other ideas, feel free to put those in the chat box. So here are just some examples of putting all of this together. So perhaps your monitoring variable is thinking about invasive species control. And so perhaps then your criteria for evaluation would be to check those areas and see if they have maybe less than 20% cover from invasive species. And you could do that through annual invasive species surveys in the late fall. Another example would be looking at forest canopy cover as your monitoring variable. And then your criteria for evaluation on that could be at least 60% of the canopy cover is maintained across all riparian areas. And so whatever you're choosing to monitor, the most important thing is to develop a realistic and feasible monitoring plan that can be used to help determine whether management should be altered in the future to account for new information and observation. So you've all seen this graphic before, and it's important in showing that clear connection between our goals and objectives, our anticipated impacts, and our adaptation actions. And this process can work in both directions. So as we finish our monitoring plans, our metrics are directly linked to measure the effectiveness of our adaptation tactics, which describe how we will implement our strategies and our overall concepts of resistance, resilience, and transition that we mentioned earlier. We can trace these to the management challenges and opportunities and the direct impacts on our systems for which we have identified our goals and objectives. Monitoring ultimately helps us know whether we are on track to meet those management goals and objectives with the actions that we're implementing on the ground. And this is the last step in the adaptive management process in which monitoring can inform a need for change somewhere down the road. And so with that, we hope that you're ready to tackle the last step of the adaptation workbook. And we like this step because we find the brainstorming to be really fun, and hopefully you might find some new ways to tap into existing monitoring efforts. So are there any questions at this point about step 5?
I have a question.
Okay.
What is like an ideal time to monitor to know you're like on a trajectory if you're planting seedlings? Like, is it 5 years? Or, I mean, we have deer problems too. So I don't know if that's going to tell us more about deer or more about climate change.
Yes, yeah, we also have deer problems here. I think that's pretty prevalent in most areas. I might turn this question over to Patricia. She has more of a forestry background than I do. Patricia, do you have any input on that?
Can you repeat the question?
I was just wondering what is realistic or ideal for following the survivability of seedlings that are planted. Like we're going to plant 4,400 seedlings, not all of them at Sawmill, but like, I'm just curious, like, do you have to track them for 5 years to know how climate change is affecting them, or can 1 or 2 years?
That was just an example. And I think that example was focusing on a much smaller number of seedlings. So yeah, you can certainly just check them. If you're doing other forest management, that often gets tacked into that post management survey where, you know, folks are going out and looking at whether the management had been done and how the seedlings are coming back and natural regeneration, and then also kind of wrapping in planted seedlings to that. But there are, you know, there's a number of ways that you could do it that really makes sense for you. You could set up random plots to look at how seedlings are doing in specific locations, and then kind of extrapolate from there how your seedlings are doing across your whole project area. And then you could do that survey, you know, every, like maybe a year after you plant them, or whatever really makes sense for your project size and your project area.
Do some people put flags by every seedling they plant so you can tell percent survivability?
No, I don't think, not on the scale that you're working at. I think if you were working in more of like a, you know, a food forest setting or something like that, where you're planting specific trees in specific locations, it would make sense to flag them. But otherwise, you might just, you know, that plot idea where you just flag your plots, and then you kind of know how many in that initial plot that you planted, and then you would go back to that plot to see how many seedlings have survived just in that plot. And if you replicate that across a larger area, then you can kind of calculate, okay, so we're looking at, you know, 80% in this plot, 60% in this plot, and then you can kind of average those out and guess, you know, across your entire area, how are all of those seedlings doing?
Okay.
And it's pretty common to lose a fair number of seedlings when you're doing it that way, because you're not watering them and you're not really protecting them from deer and other herbivores. So your seedling survival rate, you know, it might be 50% or even less on that larger scale. And Juan, were you trying to ask something?
Oh yeah, sorry. I was just gonna ask how you were protecting them, but I think you just answered that.
Yeah. So one idea that came up in a previous conversation was, you know, there was a lot of dead ash in this project area that had fallen down, and so there was a lot of debris laying around. And folks that I have talked to about like natural regeneration and also protecting plantings across larger areas have used brush fences to try to keep deer out. So if you have a lot of woody material, and especially if you have too much, then you could look at stacking that up to create a debris fence. Or you could just do that, you know, if you have a high priority planting area, maybe you don't have to try to do a perimeter around your whole property area, but you could focus in on though, you know, just that high priority area and build a debris fence around that. That's the cheap, natural way to go. But then, you know, there's more expensive fencing options that you could employ. But then there's also the bud caps that you could look into. So they're little plastic, really just plastic pieces of sheeting that you staple to like balsam fir and other conifers that to protect those terminal buds from getting snipped off by the deer. So you could look into individual tree treatments like that. I can't think of anything off the bat that would work for your deciduous species though. Individual cages, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard people who are planting more like kind of in an agricultural setting, like in rows, like they do successional planting. So you'll fence off the entire row basically instead of each individual tree. And then like maybe 2 years later, you'll switch that fence to the next planting.
Great. Do other folks have other ideas how to tackle this? this is, you know, great that we have kind of a problem solving group here. We can really learn from each other too.
Flo has used that debris fence in urban parks, but it's more to keep the mowers away than deer. And we have 2 tree nurseries and we're gonna try deer exclusion fencing.
Okay,
This year.
great. Yeah, you can keep mowers away, you can keep people away.
Hey, this is Chris. I just wanted to chime in. You were talking about ways to minimize deer damage. To me, it just seems like species selection makes a big difference. If you can plant things like sycamore that grow fast, the deer don't annihilate, that makes a difference. And if you can stomach black locust, those are great. Don't grow like weeds, and you will get at least forest canopy if that's your goal.
Awesome, thanks, Chris.
All right, great questions and dialogue and discussion. There are a few more slides, so I will move on at this point, but we may have some additional time at the end for more questions if those pop up. So we will wrap up today's session just with some pro tips on working on step 5 in the online workbook. So this week, you'll need to add a monitoring variable and apply it to your objectives, complete homework 5, and then at the end, once you're done with your plan, you can export it and share it and use the print function to save it as a PDF. So I'll talk a little bit more about these steps. So in the adaptation workbook, when you open up step 5, you'll see a little box that says add a monitoring variable. So click on that and a window will pop up where you can add your monitoring variable, criteria for evaluation, and your implementation details. And when you have all of that recorded, you can hit save. And the next workbook will ask you to apply that monitoring variable to one or more objectives, and the workbook will automatically pull up for you. All you have to do is hit yes or no, and then you can hit the orange button again to add another monitoring variable. And then don't forget also to do your homework for this week. And finally, now or whenever you're ready, maybe you need to add some management units or do some more editing, but whenever you're ready, you can find at the bottom of your navigation panel, the export and share button, and this will print your whole workbook for you. So you can click on that button and a pop-up will inform you that your plan is formatted to landscape and you'll hit OK. And that will bring up a print screen that will allow you to print as a PDF and save the plan to your computer. And if you have Adobe Pro, you can open the PDF, save your plan as a Word document, and then you'll be able to edit it directly. And if you don't have Adobe Pro, you can just forward your PDF to me or to one of the other instructors, and we'll be happy to reformat it for you. And remember, you'll have access to this workbook after the course is done, so you can keep building on it and continue working on this if you want to. And so looking ahead to our assignment for next time, you'll be completing step 5, the monitor and evaluate effectiveness step, completing the homework. And then we have here a recommended reading if you are interested in doing forest inventory. And so we would recommend for this week setting aside 2 to 3 hours for completion of this step. And then looking ahead, next lecture is a week from today, Tuesday, April 6th. We'll be having a discussion on step 5, the monitoring work. And then our lecture will be focused on communication concepts and tips that might be helpful when you're discussing climate change and the work that you've been doing in this course with others and with your partners and other networks. So the communication session is going to be really helpful because in the last week of this course, once you've gone through all of these 5 steps and you've completed your workbook, that final session of this course is designed to let you share your project with everyone else. So we're going to encourage all of you to do that, and sharing also helps you organize your thoughts so that you can become potentially one of our online adaptation demonstrations if you choose. So we'll be talking more about that in the coming weeks, but just keep it in mind and mull it over as you're completing your step 5. And so that's all that we have for this week. And we can stick around to answer any questions if anything else has come up.